Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Goldman, Executive Director of the Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom and Democracy, and a professor of political science here at George Washington University. It is truly my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. This is my favorite kind of event for two reasons. And the first is that it doesn't require me to do anything. So after reading introductions, I will translate myself off stage and disappear and let others do the talking. But the other reason that it's my favorite kind of event is that it will be a conversation of a kind that I think is not often heard at this or other universities. Too frequently, universities take for granted a consensus around a sort of liberalism or neoliberalism or centrism. You can choose your favorite synonym and treat challenges to that consensus as a form of heresy. Well, we have here this afternoon two heretics whose criticisms of liberalism are not the same, but do overlap in significant and I think unexpected ways. So as promised, I will give introductions and then disappear. Proceeding from left to right, spatially with reference to me, not in politics, is Patrick Deneen, professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. He has written 4 books and edited 3 others, including The Odyssey of Political Theory, Democratic Faith, which I strongly recommend, Conserving America, Why Liberalism Failed, and most recently, Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future. In the middle, once again spatially, not politically, is Marlène Laruelle, who will serve as moderator. Marlène is Research Professor of International Affairs and Political Science and Director of the Illiberalism Studies Program, and I'm pleased to say co-host of this event. And finally, Sam Moyn is Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale, where he also serves as head of Grace Hopper College. Trained in modern European intellectual history, which is how I was first exposed to his work. He now works on political and legal thought in historical and current perspective. His most recent book is Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times. Reviewed critically but charitably by me, I must say. So once again, welcome. I'm sure that the discussion will be provocative and yet civil, as we always strive to be, and I will turn over the floor to Marlène.
Thank you so much, Sam, for your introduction. I will immediately give the floor to our 2 speakers. I will ask them to speak about 15 minutes to give us a kind of overview of their thinking, and then I will invite them to engage into a discussion, directly responding to each other, responding to my questions also, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A. And we have about 1 hour and a half, so I'm sure we can have a really rich and a fascinating discussion. So Patrick, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Marlène. Thank you, Sam and George Washington, for this invitation. It's actually, for me, it's a little bit of a homecoming in a sense, not only because I used to teach at Georgetown up the road, the different George University. But my very first academic position was as a, what would be called an adjunct professor here at George Washington University. This is unknown and buried in the sands of time, but it was my first academic position. Thank you for the invitation, and it's one that I think we had a little bit of difficulty arriving at because of my hesitation to speak in a program called the Illiberalism Studies Program. It's a little bit like being invited to the When Did You Stop Eating Your Wife program, if you are recognized as a non-liberal. But when I had the opportunity, I was told there would be a discussion with Sam Moyn. That would shatter all of my hesitations. Anytime I could have a conversation with Sam, it's a great joy and interest. But I do think it is an issue that the program is called the Illiberalism Studies Program. and I think this is something that the program is actually aware of, that it contains in some ways a certain bias, the bias being that to call it illiberalism is something maybe somewhat slightly different than calling it non-liberalism or post-liberalism. It's illiberalism. It's ill. Maybe say clothing is ill-fitting or ill-mannered. It's worse than just being not mannered. It's really badly mannered. So illiberalism has a kind of inherent sort of negative connotation to it. But that being said, it seems to me that illiberalism as a subject is extraordinarily and profoundly important right now because, as many of you perhaps know of me, I actually think that we are empirically living in a post-liberal age. If that's illiberal, perhaps, but it's certainly post-liberal. The high watermark of liberalism has passed, it seems to me, and it's unlikely to come back in the same form, much to the chagrin of those who are in a kind of 90s nostalgia. And the problem that programs like this one and universities face more generally, it seems to me, is that they're very poorly positioned to examine precisely what's going on, even for a program called the program of the Illiberalism Studies program. Because of the way in which the universities as a whole, this program, I think, as one representative of that, begins with an assumption that the basic norm by which we organize all of civilization and understand the only legitimate way of thinking about the political world is through a political lens. This is the kind of operating system by which we have assumed to be the case for at least the last 50 years. But illiberalism is a real problem. And it's not an illiberalism that we talk enough about in these kinds of institutions. To echo some of the points made by, I'm sure, one of the most popular persons in this room, Vice President Vance, in his recent address in Munich, the greatest threat to liberty today arguably does not come from an external threat of Russia or Hungary or China even, if one wishes in some ways to say there is a great illiberal threat in the West, but it comes internally from liberalism itself, or from the dynamics of liberalism in the advanced Western liberal democracies, so-called. I'll call them so-called liberal democracies, and if I don't, assume I'm saying so-called. It would consume all of my 15 minutes to rehearse every single instance of illiberalism that we have witnessed over at least the last 10, if not 20 or 30 years in nations such as the United States or Western Europe, being performed and done and undertaken in the name of liberalism. But let me just mention a few, and you'll get the gist. I guess to begin with, I would have to at least outline what might be some of the few features of liberalism that we might all agree upon as just kind of a ground, sort of baseline position. And from that baseline, just to mention a few of the ways in which we can see evidence of liberal backsliding. These features might include things like free speech, religious liberty, respect for democracy, and neutrality of government. At least that's just four to begin with. On these fronts, liberalism is arguably under assault by liberalism itself. We're doubtless all aware of the severe patrolling of free speech that's taken place in liberal democracies over the past number of years. This is especially the case in institutions, I'm not saying this one in particular, but institutions like this one, the great universities of the West, in which free speech has become such a contested and often constrained issue. Cancellation and the heckler's veto has been one of the primary ways that this phenomenon has been manifested. But knowledge of the threat of these potential reactions has had a dampening effect on free speech in nearly every domain, not merely the contemporary universities. Examples are too countless to list, but some of the more notorious ones would include the successful effort to disinvite Condoleezza Rice as commencement speaker of my alma mater, Rutgers University, and the disinvitation of Dorian Abbott to speak at MIT in 2021, the fevered denunciation of the Christakises at Sam's Yale University in 2015 over Halloween costumes, the boycott of a local bakery near Oberlin College, encouraged and supported by faculty over what turned out to be false claims about its racism, the owner's racism. The shouting down, I think most notoriously, the shouting down and physical assault on Charles Murray and his host political scientist Allison Stanger at Middlebury College in 2017, the cancellation of numerous speakers in campuses all over the country, including Kyle Duncan, a federal judge at Stanford University Law School in 2023, and my former colleague Robert George, who was there to speak at Washington College to speak about civility, who was shouted down and prevented from speaking at nearby Washington College. I might continue to add to these examples, which again are too numerous to list, but they emerge in a backdrop in which scholarly inquiry has been compromised, it seems to me, by a high degree of social activism that has given priority to the creation of safe spaces, of trigger warnings that make it difficult to assign, much less teach and talk frankly about certain works, speech codes, the creation of administrative apparatuses that increasingly exist to encourage reporting, often anonymous reporting of perceived microaggressions and hate speech, and the requirement of DEI statements to apply for a position at many of the colleges and universities in the country. And I say that as someone who was not asked to write a faith statement when I applied to the University of Notre Dame and was shocked that I wasn't. And yet we have faith statements as a requirement of many institutions today. These threats to free speech have spilled over out of the university. As Andrew Sullivan said, we all live on campus now, and so we have patrolling of free speech in the form of identifying and suppressing misinformation and hate speech, often on social media. Companies, as we learned in one case at least, compelled or forced by the Biden administration in the case of Facebook to designate and ban what it regarded as misinformation. The Biden information also weaponized the FBI through the designation of various opposition groups as posing a domestic threat, as domestic terrorists. Among these were included parents who were critical of COVID policies at school board meetings around the country. Vice President Vance's criticism of European hostility to free speech was especially directed at the broad powers of the EU to enforce speech code through its European Digital Services Act that again gives broad latitude to designate and make arrests on the basis of spreading disinformation and engaging in incitement. Other European threats to free speech are widely in effect in Germany, as discussed if those of you saw a segment on 60 Minutes the other night, in which among those things that could make one subject to arrest includes insulting politicians. My God, where would we be in Washington, D.C.? Other threats that the Vice President pointed out were arrests that have been made of individuals who were silently praying outside of abortion clinics in England and in Scotland. And a remarkable scene unfolded in downtown Brussels in 2024 when the mayor of Brussels set up a cordon of armed guard to prevent attendees at the National Conservatism Conference, which was meeting in Brussels at that time, from entering the conference hotel where that meeting was taking place. This was the conference hotel that was the third conference hotel booked by the conference under pressure of the mayor and the political class to cancel the meetings at bookings at other hotels. And only a massive media spotlight led to the Brussels government eventually backing down. We've seen the suspension of banking and access to financing, particularly, and I think most egregiously, in 2022 when the banking privileges of truckers who were peacefully protesting COVID lockdown policies had their banking privileges suspended by the Trudeau government in Canada. We've seen a steady increase of threats to religious liberty that have kept the courts very busy, from the HHS mandate of the Obama administration, which required objecting religious groups, including the Little Sisters of the Poor, a group of nuns, indirectly to be party to the provision of contraception, including abortifacients, the efforts to force business people into providing goods to events that they could not in good conscience support, the successful effort by large corporations in my home state of Indiana to reverse a democratically enacted Religious Freedom Restoration Act, this was in 2015, by the threat of economic destruction of the state, by removing access to those corporations. Something was cheerled by the New York Times Magazine. Said there was an article by Frank Bruning called The Sunny Side of Greed. We've seen the designation of certain Catholics deemed to be radical traditional Catholics by the FBI to be a potential source of domestic terrorism and warranting FBI infiltration in order to achieve threat mitigation, I quote. by infiltrating those churches. We've seen extraordinary efforts by the United States government to influence and in some cases overturn and overthrow duly elected governments, including in some cases funding provided through the National Endowment of Democracy to support various color revolutions throughout Eastern Europe and the Middle East, including, of course, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine that lies in the backdrop of where we are today. Most recently, we witnessed the cancellation of the Romanian election by the Romanian Constitutional Court, which claimed due to Russian interference, but also the strong showing in the polls of a right-leaning figure, Calin Georgescu. And in the lead-up of the German election recently, a former European commissioner, Thierry Breton, told French television that if the German AfD party won the election in Germany, they could be annulled by the European Union, as was done in Romania, he said. Many of these examples put to lie, then, the claim that liberalism erects a neutral system of government, a lie that has been further exposed by efforts of Doge to publicize and eliminate funding in various parts of the U.S. government, including, of course, most notoriously perhaps USAID funding, which has, among other things, been revealed to have funded opposition movements and media in countries with conservative governments, including El Salvador, Hungary, and just today a report on its influence in Poland, where USAID funds went towards support of groups opposed to the governing party then, Law and Justice, including opposition media and efforts to suppress advertising purchases by the conservative network TV Republica. I could go on, but my time is short. Now, whether you agree with any of these particulars or some of these particulars with my assessment that the liberal West is among the greatest threats to its own purported liberalism, it is certainly the case that many, many, many people perceive that the elites who lead or have led the liberal West in recent years are a threat to their liberty. Or better put, certain substantive liberal commitments have led to the eager willingness to use illiberal means to secure what are believed to be substantively liberal ends, leading to the increased unpopularity of those elites in a coalition today of more libertarian-leaning old liberals and anti- or post-liberals, hence the MAGA and Doge friendship these days. Given this growing, evident, and politically disastrous evidence of a vast and growing number of illiberal practices from within the heart of so-called liberal democracies, one would think that the leading institute in existence that studies, examines, explicates, and clarifies what is happening in the liberal nations of the West would be right here. But having looked, and I stand to be correct, I would be welcome to be correct, but having looked at the program's website in recent days, I see no evidence whatsoever that there is the least interest or curiosity about this emergence and emanation of illiberalism from within the so-called liberal West by an institute, this being just one, I think broadly American universities in general, of precisely what are the sources and reasons and causes and consequences of this illiberalism. Let me just give you a few examples of the recently published papers online of this program. Catholic traditionalists on the far right, dreaming of Russia, those who wish to emigrate to Russia. Giorgia Meloni on immigration. Jean-Marie Le Pen, Orban's transatlantic strategy. In its printed journal, focus on such nations as North Korea, Russia, China, Hungary, Israel, and not a country, but Elon Musk. As far as illiberalism in the US, a special section is devoted entitled Frontiers of American Reaction. I think that gives you all you need to know. Reaction. There's an article on Vance, Musk, and Bannon. The building of the international right with a focus on CPAC. Trump and the Southern Lost Cause. Trump and the transformation of the Republican Party. Maybe my favorite, trad wifery, pastries, and patriarchy. And yes, Alistair McIntyre and the post-liberal right with a shout out to me. Did you notice anything missing in that list? That's pretty representative, not entirely comprehensive. Notice anything missing in that list? Not a single mention in all of these discussions of illiberalism, both domestic and international, of the illiberalism that's happening right at our doorstep. Right here. Maybe not right here, right now, but in places like this university and most other universities. Why is illiberalism only a right-wing phenomenon, according to this center and much of the contemporary university. It reveals then a kind of extraordinary set of blinders. Liberalism can't be illiberal, is the basic presupposition. Or to put it another way, maybe to modify Barry Goldwater's famous phrase, extremism in the defense of liberalism is no vice. Moderation in illiberal pursuits of liberalism is no virtue. I think I'm out of time, but let me just conclude by foreshadowing one of the things I would like for us to be able to talk about. This inability to see the illiberalism that is liberalism, that emerges from within the liberal order, makes it very difficult for us to assess what actually is or are the various forms of post-liberalism, which is not simply one thing. We're here to talk about post-liberalism, but it's not one thing. There is a post-liberalism that is a liberal post-liberalism, which I think describes in some ways where we are right now. And in some senses, we have no choice but to be post-liberal, because liberalism itself generates illiberal forms and practices in the name of being liberal. So we have to live in a kind of paradoxical situation in which it's not whether we are post-liberal, but what form and what kind we will be. And until we can examine the illiberalism that is, in fact, emerging from, and perhaps not necessarily inescapably from within liberalism itself, we are hamstrung in our ability to have a frank discussion about the nature of our political moment.
Okay, I'll be briefer and more informal. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks to Patrick. We have a small road show where I follow him around and make a few comments, and I'll do so again. So what you might call the Great Liberal Freakout began in earnest, really, in 2016 for obvious reasons. After the Brexit vote, the English journalist Edward Luce wrote The Retreat of Western Liberalism. Of course, Patrick scored a breakthrough in the publication of his book about why liberalism failed. And we shouldn't forget that in that moment, a fair number of liberalism were what you might call illiberalism curious. Barack Obama. We shouldn't forget that the product of the allegedly woke university where I teach, J.D. Vance, was initially celebrated by liberals as a kind of illiberalism whisperer to understand why they hate us. But we're at a new stage. And I'd say in its essentials, the debate about liberalism, which is responsible for centers like this, has consisted of two sides that deserve each other. The excoriators, like Patrick, and the extenuators, like most everyone else that you'll find in the MSM. I'm trying to take a very beleaguered, moderate stance, which is that liberalism needs to be saved from the liberals, and the record of their mistakes and abandonment and betrayal of the best in liberalism. Now, that sets up, as far as I see it, a debate about exactly what Patrick has raised, the ways in which liberals have set their own ideals back. It's just that I don't think that's a congenital or terminal set of mistakes, but ones from which liberalism will have to recover if it's going to survive. I think Patrick and I agreed that high on the list of those mistakes, at least in recent decades, have been militarism and foreign policy, what I've heard Patrick, I think correctly, refer to as the war machine, and neoliberalism in economics, which has, in my judgment, and I believe a fair number of others, created such a backlash as the business cycle has regularly done against liberalism throughout their history, whenever you think it begins, that it needs to be singled out as the most grievous mistake. And yet, Patrick's right. The extenuating habits of our time among the liberals have led to circling the wagons, to condemning the enemies as if liberal mistakes, self-imposed mistakes, weren't themselves responsible for the creation of those enemies, and providing them new fodder and fuel every day. So there is some commonality, but there's a root difference, which is that I think there's a salvageable core of liberalism if it's not too late. And the main question, even now, under the second Donald Trump administration, is whether liberals refuse to take the time they have to look inward, look in the mirror. The physicians need to heal themselves. And as far as I can see, they're not doing it either in the domain of foreign policy or, and above all, in the domain of economics. Now, what might, I think, follow from these claims is some historical debate. And maybe I'm furthest away from Patrick when it comes to the history of liberalism. As I mentioned, his view of liberalism associates it with, let's call them, congenital sins that may take time to play out, but are eventually terminal. I disagree, in part because I also work with a much shorter timeline for the liberal phenomenon. Patrick thinks it's about 500 years old in a story that leads from Occam to the opioid crisis. I think it's a couple hundred years old, not without antecedents, for sure. But the first self-styled liberals appear in the early 19th century. And in America, in this country, aside from a very few after the Civil War, really those who call themselves liberals are the progressives that emerge with the founding of the New Republic magazine after World War I. If we look at that shorter timeline, I think we find not congenital maladies or sins, but internal, intramural debate. And I think those debates have generally been resolved in the wrong way. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't fall on us to consider our options, especially if we think illiberals or post-liberals don't have better answers, don't give us a clear enough picture that appeals to common criteria to explain why a successor order to liberalism would indeed improve on some of the shortcomings that they often, I think, plausibly identify. In my view, liberalism was the first great emancipatory ideology of modern times. The second was socialism, and liberals could become socialists, help invent the thing. A good example being John Stuart Mill, who began as a libertarian of sorts and ended as, I think very properly, as a Bernie bro, in part under the feminist influence of Harriet Taylor. But it's absolutely true that liberals all along have a lot to answer for. In foreign policy, their militarism is not of recent vintage, although in this country it was reinvented in relatively recent decades. Liberals have been imperialists more often than not. And Americans, when they became the leading liberal power after World War II, picked up that legacy. I think they exacerbated it in recent times through a particularly militarist kind of foreign policy that they've shown, I think, few signs that they're willing to reconsider and relinquish. But that doesn't mean that liberals can't champion their emancipatory ideology in some other, more productive way that doesn't face and lead to the dire straits that liberalism clearly has entered today. Same with economics. There's just no way to deny that most liberals in history, theorists and especially politicians, have been advocates of laissez-faire, the standard liberal policy of the 19th century, or neoliberalism, the standard liberal policy of the later 20th, and that most definitely has to be defined to include old school conservatives, the old Republicans, who were basically a kind of right liberal faction that has been overthrown, and for good reason. The trouble is liberals themselves in their own party, historically in this country, the Democratic, haven't overthrown their neoliberals and offered a credible alternative to the millions of voters who have voted for Donald Trump in protest of where the centrists have led this country and the world, for that matter. Maybe one last comment is about one point I very much agree with Patrick about, which is that a liberalism that feigns neutrality is lying. But I disagree with him that that's an inevitable mistake, because as far as I see it, the founding liberal theorists offered a new vision about how we should live. They offered a highest good for human beings, which certain critics of liberalism say has not been available since the days of Plato and Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, because modernity is too relativistic and tolerationist. But that view flies in the face of the very obvious fact that the founding liberals like Mill and Alexis de Tocqueville offered a perfectionist liberalism and said liberals should stand for emancipation of our creative powers. What's happened, alas, since is that liberals have betrayed that vision. It happened in the 19th century. It's happened in recent decades, and only if they undo that mistake and look in the mirror at how they're responsible for our current situation will liberalism survive.
Well, thank you both for sharing your thought. I think we will have a lot of things to discuss. I never imagined I would have to try to rescue my own program from Patrick's attack, so thank you for giving me that.
It's an assignment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for giving me that opportunity. I will say two things in remark on that, and then we will shift away from the program here to your own comments. One is, you're right about the description of the field. I mean, the field of studies is a field that considers that liberalism in its more kind of classic version of what is shared and seen as the so-called or supposed per default consensus is the majority. And that when scholars are looking at things they define as illiberalism, they would look mostly on the right side. And our website is reflecting the state of the field. That said, if you would have looked in the way I'm describing the field, and on some of the publication we had a long part on what we called and could be called leftist illiberalism. We had several articles on culture war, and especially in higher education institution, looking exactly at some elements you were mentioning and questioning. Do we have tools to describe that kind of woke, emancipatory, identity politics, you call it as you want, as a form of leftist illiberalism? So the field exists. When the field is studies like that, as a kind of either leftist illiberalism, it's mostly coming from kind of neo-Marxist perspective, and not from conservative. It's not that there is no conservative view, it's just that the presence of conservative political scientists or conservative academics in the field is, it exists, but it exists in another universe, in a sense, than the one with which we interact. So that critique is there, but it's coming from the old left, if I can say, kind of Marxist left, criticizing the shift. So it's there, but it's a minority in the field. That said, we move away from our program, and I wanted to kind of give you question to each of you to kind of continue the discussion. Patrick, so we had a, I think, very clear vision of your description of liberalism being illiberal by many aspects. Where I would like to push you and then give you back the floor, it's on the notion of post-liberalism. You said several times we are living in a post-liberal situation, and in a sense it's a kind of obvious way to move. And there is always for me a tension in the use of post. Right? Is that post in a chronological sense? Liberalism is no more the obvious per default normative system, and we are outside of that. Or is that post with the content? And if it's post-liberalism just chronologically, then okay, then what next, right? It doesn't, tell us liberalism is over in its cultural hegemony. But if we are post-liberalism in the content, what is the content? And how do you articulate elements? You mentioned the kind of libertarianism tradition that you presented as a kind of old-fashioned liberalism on some aspect, and the communitarianism, right? How do we deal in post-liberalism with this tension, which I think we are seeing in practice on many aspects also here now? So I would like you to take the opportunity of that question to launch a longer discussion on that. Sam, I think also I would like you to comment on the emancipatory nature of liberalism. What does that mean today? From what do we have to be emancipated from, right? How do we reinvent that emancipation without shifting to the kind of leftist or woke, or I don't know how Patrick would call liberalism, right? Is that emancipatory from neoliberalism? Is that on the economic side? Is that how do we reinvent the common goods? So is the next step to emancipate, to then not move toward more kind of individualism, but back? And in that case, if it's back, is that emancipatory? Or to reinventing common good and things we share, and something that are limiting our own identity or limiting our own individualism to give us more collective identity? Is that the next step of what could be emancipation? So two broad questions to kind of give you the floor back, and then probably after we'll open for the Q&A.
First of all, thank you for that clarification, and it would be of great interest to begin to expand the Illiberalism studies program to include a variety of perspectives that would include those from the right. Because it really does seem to me that today, it's shocking and surprising. The people most likely to invoke John Stuart Mill on college campuses today are not people like Sam Moyn. It's people like Robert George, the conservative Catholic at Princeton University, who views John Stuart Mill as his best friend because Mill defends something called viewpoint diversity. Now, viewpoint diversity sounds good, and that's universities love the word diversity. I just did a real quick search of political donations here at George Washington University to get a sense of the viewpoint diversity. Yale is 98.4% went to Democrats in 2024. George Washington University is more diverse. Only 98% of the donations of employees at George Washington University went to Democrats. 1.46% went to Republicans, which means just barely above none of the above, by about half, about 1 percentage point. So that's why John Stuart Mill is now one of the heroes of the conservatives on campus, because oddly enough, so if you want to look for the defense of liberalism on college campuses today, where all of these viewpoints are being debated and defended, you're most likely to hear defenses of liberalism, classic liberal canons from conservatives. And so it's, again, striking that if you're interested in illiberalism, you may want to check in with some of that diminishing number of people. I noticed that Harvard clocked in at 95% donations to Democrats. That's got to go down now because Harvey Mansfield has retired. Just to stay on the theme of John Stuart Mill, though, to answer your question, what's meant by post-liberalism, or as I really think of it increasingly, post-liberalisms, because it really is, it's not a singular thing. It's going to be a contested area. It already is a contested area. And I would simply say that what I described in my opening comments is one form of post-liberalism. It's liberal post-liberalism. It's the form of in which liberalism has taken as it has embraced more and more practices, illiberal practices in the name of defending liberalism. And becoming more and more stridently and aggressively and even using the powers of government. Supposedly, one of its commitments was to a limited government and a government of the rule of law, but a willingness to even circumvent some of those commitments in the name of defending liberalism. Unlike Sam, though, I see this development not as a contingent development that just happened to take place maybe because the bad orange man happened to come onto the scene, but in fact arising from the very heart of liberalism. And I'll use as my justification the figure that Sam invoked as the great articulator of liberal principles and liberal philosophy, John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was quite clear that in the name of defending such things as free speech and progress, emancipation perhaps, that one would have to, in some cases, limit or circumvent such things as free speech. In the very opening pages, this touches on Sam's comment on imperialism, in the very opening pages of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, he's quite clear that in societies that can be deemed or viewed from the standpoint of more advanced liberal civilizations as backward, those societies can be placed into despotism for a period of time until through a kind of forcing them to be free, they can emerge on the other side from that despotism into a state of freedom. In his book, Considerations of Representative Government, he speaks of the need, again in these backward countries, even to effect personal slavery for a time among backward peoples until they too have emerged from the condition of being backward into, particularly he says, by forcing them to work in industrial practices so that they're no longer being farmers and the like. In countries that are more advanced, such as England, the treatment of those who are backward is not as extreme. In this case, one just has to ensure that the progressive side of society, the more enlightened side of society is always going to be in control politically. His great fear is that the unwashed masses, the people who are gaining the vote at that time, will circumvent or thwart progress. And so he proposes, among other things, that people like us, people with a lot of degrees, will get more votes than the people who just haven't finished high school. So that it can always be assured that progress will remain in the front seat. Even if we have democracy, it'll be a democracy with a finger on the scale. And this is all to say that in John Stuart Mill's arguments at the very outset of liberalism, there are essentially those things that we think of as the core values of liberalism, including free speech, is always at the service of some other end, which in this case conforms very closely to what Sam was describing as the better and true liberalism, which is a kind of progress and a kind of human emancipation. And for those who don't embrace that end or haven't yet seen its virtue and its desirability, they will in a sense be forced to be free or will be excluded from the system, whether in the form of despotism, personal slavery, or simply getting outvoted, or the system will be arranged in order to ensure that end. It was John Stuart Mill who served as the inspiration of an infamous but important essay by Herbert Marcuse, his essay, 1965 essay, Repressive Tolerance, in which Marcuse argued exactly, he gave us the playbook for exactly what is happening today on college campuses, that those who are of a conservative worldview or sensibility should have their rights to free speech removed, should be prevented from speaking because they were saying things which could no longer be seen as defensible within a liberal order. Right? Marcuse argues the tactics of the withdrawal of the toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements which promote aggressive policies, armament, chauvinism, discrimination on the grounds of race and religion, or who oppose the extension of public services, Social Security, Medicare, etc., requires new and rigid restrictions on teaching and practices in the educational institutions which by their very methods and concepts serve to enclose the mind within the established universe and discourse of behavior. Now, who would decide who would have the speech removed? So it would be rationally done, but what would be established, and I quote, a democratic educational dictatorship of free men. This was done in the name of ensuring liberation. His The only figure that he cites as an authority in this essay, 9 times, is John Stuart Mill. It's not Karl Marx, not Hegel, it's John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is his authority. The reasons for which and the grounds on which free speech can be removed and forestalled by those who are deemed to be backwards. So I think it's not an accident or contingent that we find ourselves now in this particular post-liberal moment. It's a post-liberalism that has emerged from within liberalism itself. So it is ironically, it's post in both senses. It's a chronological post, but it's also post in the way that postmodernism is postmodern. It's hypermodern. It's hyperliberalism. It's liberalism on steroids. It's going to ensure liberalism no matter what, even if it has to betray liberalism's basic values and features.
So, I can't resist commenting on some of that as well as, getting around.
Maybe we should switch order once in a while.
In the long run, sure. Well, no. I do have to answer Marlene's question about emancipation. So, there's this very interesting fact about the debate on liberalism that both the excoriators like Patrick and the lead extenuators are obsessed with campus. And I think the best example of this is really the most immediate response to Donald Trump's first election by the Electoral College, which is Mark Lilla's. And his arguments about where liberalism went wrong are all about campus, and they're all about, I think, similar sources as Patrick just attacked, including Herbert Marcuse, and how wokeness allegedly led us astray. Now, I think that dramatically overstates the importance of what's going on campuses, though we are part of them, to the overall situation. Not that they're unimportant, not that there haven't been excesses. There are some attempts to correct some of those right now. I am at Yale, as has been mentioned, and we're hiring conservatives. And we've been doing so for several years. The political science department where you would teach is, in political theory, dominated by conservatives. So I think we just cannot exaggerate. And it's not that there aren't liberal mistakes at the heart of liberal academia, but that they can be corrected. And above all, we shouldn't take universities as like a synecdoche for the genuine ills of the liberal order across the West, which I think have very little to do with what's happening on campus.
Sam, if I just may,
sure.
It's not just campus though. It's our media, it's our entertainment. You could say that sort of the figures of authority in the leading institutions of globally. So when Andrew Sullivan made the argument we're all living on campus now, maybe it's focal point for us as campus, but it's not limited to campus.
Totally fair, but then we would need to open up the debate to the really broadest facts about the transformation of the media landscape. I mean, in my understanding, Fox News is doing well. MSNBC, the mothership of the resistance, is unpopular and firing its hosts. X is owned by a right-wing oligarch. So it's actually more complex. I totally agree that it was a terrible mistake for liberal academia to police orthodoxy and refuse to hire conservatives, which again is being corrected. But if we open up things more broadly, I just don't think the story of liberal or woke hegemony was ever true, and it's less and less true today. Now, I just want to be very clear that I don't believe that the crisis of liberalism is a matter of contingent events like in 2016. My own story emphasized earlier catastrophic mistakes in embracing militarist and neoliberal policy decades before then and setting up the very possibility of 2016. And further back, I would say there is this fact that liberals have a tilt. They seem to favor imperialist solutions in foreign policy, past and present. They seem to keep drifting back to relatively less regulated and fair forms of capitalism. And this is a tilt that, of course, Marx thought condemned it as much as you do to perdition. I think there's a chance to save its emancipatory legacy from this tilt, but there's no foregone conclusion that that will work. What we really want to hear is, if you don't think that's possible, why should we embrace post-liberalism, other than that liberalism inevitably leads to it? Like, what's good about post-liberalism? So that, to me, I think that onus ought to fall on you too, not just on me to explain how, it's, not just a contingent that liberalism is facing these self-imposed mistakes. Now, on emancipation, when I introduced that concept, I never mentioned individualism. And there's a good reason why, because to the best of my limited understanding, although there are some hippies in the liberal tradition and people who celebrate them, John Stuart Mill probably comes close, long before the 1960s. Most of the greatest creative achievements in human history have been done first by collectives, by groups, and more important, in societies that consecrate themselves to novelty and innovation. I think one of the biggest troubles and the principal cause of our malaise is that one of the appeals of markets is that, as the Wall Street Journal used to advertise when we were young, is that there are adventures in capitalism, like it's a space for creativity and innovation. And many people have benefited from those adventures. The trouble is, it's also a space that creates a new domination hierarchy. And liberals learn this, in part on their own, in part from Marx. And it's this lesson that they've relinquished. And so my own view is that emancipation can take individual and collective forms, but most important is a collective project and requires a collectivist theory of the proper institutions that would protect individual freedom from overweening states, but, as Tocqueville insisted, protect all of us from one another, from the domination we impose through culture and norms, and then, as Marx insisted, deal with the immiserating and hierarchical features that we know markets to have, not just on a local scale, but on a global scale. So this is a very important point that I just am not clear why that would lead us to refer vaguely to the common good, which is just begging all the questions about, well, what is that good? Is it the medieval common good or the modern one?
I think it's time for us to open the floor to you all. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. I propose we go by series of